It is the Awesemo MLB Strategy Show, sponsored by Jock Market. Tyler really mixing up with the music. I was confused for a second because I don't know if you used that on another show before. It's not anything I've heard. But I immediately started looking at my computer to make sure I didn't have some other window playing in a pop-up. Like I thought it was one of those things where, if you like stats up from ESPN or FanGraphs sometimes and randomly an ad will pop up. But no, that was just Tyler's odd music selection. So Adam, did that throw you off at all?
Yeah, I was confused for a couple of seconds, and then I remembered that Tyler was producing and weird shit just happens.
Yeah, that was. By the way, I don't like that music. Bring back the old music. Those are not the tunes I want to start my day with. But what I do generally want to start my day with is talking a little bit of baseball here with Shit My Money, Adam Scherer, and we've got a slate today, which is pretty sizable and. Also, we've got a pretty wide range of options. This isn't like some of the other slates where I feel like we've only had cheap pitching options, only had expensive pitching options, no Coors Field game. That's kind of nice. So we're just your kind of overall thoughts on this slate before we start talking about the game by game.
Yeah, so like you said, no Coors Field game is always nice. We don't have the top stack tool or anything updated yet, so hard to have too much to say in that regard. But, you do have Freddie Peralta at the top. You have McClanahan behind him in a tough spot. It does look like a lot of not all. A lot of the pitchers at the top are in relatively tough matchups. Then you have Yu Darvish against the Angels. We kind of saw how that goes yesterday when Snell was facing the Angels in a similar situation. So it does seem like, like you said, there's a lot of different ways you can go. Pitching is pretty spread out, but a lot of these guys do have pretty tough matchups. And so I'm interested to see if that kind of forces very concentrated ownership into a couple of spots, sort of like we saw last night. Granted, Snell was clearly mispriced, but you saw 50% ownership going to Blake Snell on a 12-game slate because a lot of the alternatives had really tough matchups, and then Snell was just facing basically a minor league team.
Yeah, the big thing with Snell too, and I can't remember exactly what the timing was when Shohei Ohtani ended up not being in the lineup, and it was kind of iffy to me. I wasn't totally sure if he was going to be in or out of the lineup, but it was either right before I did Live Before Lock with Eric or either right before your deeper dive show. But it was a thing where it was like, all right, maybe I could get away from some of the Snell ownership. And then once Ohtani was in the lineup, it kind of felt like it was inevitable and had to differentiate elsewhere. So I didn't have a massive amount of Snell. I was somewhere around the field, but sometimes there's chalk plays that are kind of hard to get away from. And we'll see. Like you said, we don't have ownership updated right now. We don't have top stacks tool or any of that. It'll probably be coming at some point during the show, but one team I have to imagine is going to be chalk is right off the bat here. We've got the Toronto Blue Jays going up against the New York Yankees, and maybe this isn't going to be the chalk, but never mind. I was thinking about the next game with Matt Harvey pitching, but for the Toronto Blue Jays, Alek Manoah against Luis Gil, and these two pitchers I both think have pretty considerable upside between Manoah and Gil, but it is also a really difficult matchup. So, what are you going to make of the pitchers and the offenses here?
Yeah, it is really tough. Luis Gil's been good in his time in the major leagues. Kind of surprised that he wasn't up longer, but as a starter so far, 28.1% strikeout percentage, no home runs, 4.7 xFIP, has certainly gotten lucky as far as stranding runners. 100% strand rate so far for Gil, but the strikeout numbers have been good. Walk rate's a little higher than you would like. The thing it really comes back to though is, he's talented, but this matchup against the Blue Jays is just so tough. And I ended up playing a good amount of Garrett Cole yesterday. Obviously went really poorly, but this is just such a difficult team to target because not only are they a really, really good offense, they just don't strike out. And normally when you get offenses that are this good, especially in this era of baseball, normally you at least get a situation like the Yankees where it's like, oh, well, they can score 10 runs in a hurry, but they also can strike out 10 times. The Blue Jays just don't strike out on top of being able to score. So that makes it really, really difficult, I think, to really like getting to pitching against them. It's a cheap price tag on Gil, but still, I think a pretty tough sell because of the matchup.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see the ownership here. Generally, when we see some of these, not totally top of the line starting pitchers, but somebody like Gil, Manoah, I don't think the Yankees or Blue Jays are going to have a ton of ownership. This seems like a spot where there's potential for them each to come in, like 2 to 3% owned because the price tags are pretty exorbitant in these offenses. And then also just that the pitchers aren't terrible. But some of these guys like Giancarlo Stanton, 5,100, Bo Bichette, 52, Semien, 5,000, got Vlad, Aaron Judge. So I think there's a chance that we see these teams come into pretty reasonable ownership. If that's a chance, I think these are going to be teams that make sense as contrarian stacks. Something we've done a lot this year is pay up to be contrarian with teams like the Blue Jays and the Yankees. And then also something else to consider. It does seem like the wind is going to be blowing out at about 15 miles per hour at Yankee Stadium. Say if that's the case later in the day, that would also set up pretty nicely for offense.
Yeah, right there with you. It seems, or it feels to me like one of those spots where everyone's going to respect the offenses enough to not look at the pitching too much, but then they're also going to respect the pitching enough to not look at the offenses too much. And it's just going to be a situation where if you're only using medium projections and you're not doing anything to incorporate range of outcomes into how you build lineups or how you choose your lineups, you're just not going to get to either side of this game when really there's a ton of upside everywhere because it's a bad matchup for Heel, but he's still got a lot of strikeout upside. Alek Manoah certainly has strikeout upside here against the Yankees, even if he's not particularly likely to have a good game. But then also if either of these pitchers struggle, the opposing offenses are good enough to take advantage. So it is a game where, assuming the ownership is low, I'm with you, paying up to get to these Blue Jays bats or the Yankees bats, relatively low probability spot, but still a really, really high upside offense in both cases, both teams with implied run totals near 5. So yeah, I'm with you. If there's not ownership going to the offenses, I'm definitely interested.
Yeah, we've got a pick'em game. The total in this spot is sitting at 10 right now. And this is the game that I meant to, because I realized that on my sheet versus what I sent to Tyler, I accidentally mixed up the order of the games. But this game right here, we have the Kansas City Royals against the Baltimore Orioles. The Orioles pitching staff, we know how bad they've been this year. Matt Harvey also has not been particularly good. And the Kansas City Royals have been a very, very popular stack over the last couple of weeks. I have to assume this is going to be another spot where they're very popular going up against Baltimore. So just kind of at first glance, based on the eye test, I am assuming that the Kansas City Royals are going to be the chalk of the slate. So let's walk through the spot they have against Matt Harvey. And what do you think is going to be a reasonable way to look at a chalky Royal stack today?
Yeah, I mean, that's my read as well. We had Adalberto Mondesi yesterday on a 12-game Coors Field slate, pull 31% ownership on DraftKings, batting cleanup at 4,400. He's 4,400 again today, has multi-position eligibility as well. Salvador Perez is expensive, but he's absolutely phenomenal. Merrifield's priced up. Other than that, though, the team is just so cheap. It's really hard to think that they don't pull ownership with a 5+ implied run total here. Nicky Lopez most likely batting second as a value shortstop option. Benintendi at 3,500, Santana at 3K, and then the bottom of the order basically free as well. So I do expect them to get ownership. It's a good spot, but Kansas City is typically a team that when they get ownership, I look elsewhere just because they certainly still have upside, especially in this park in this matchup. But there's always going to be offenses that just have better hitters. And so typically I end up being under the field when they're popular, but that's not to say they aren't really good values. And if you can find ways to mix them into low owned stacks, I think that's perfectly fine because it is a very good spot here against Harvey and the Orioles bullpen.
All right. So as of a minute ago, we have ownership updates and pretty spot on right here with what we were saying. So the Kansas City Royals, currently projected for a 21.4% ownership share compared to a 10.6% chance to be the top scoring team of the slate. Considering that kind of information, and it's still early in the day, that's just a stack I wouldn't be getting to with those kind of numbers.
Yeah, exactly. And so we had talked on the show yesterday with Coors Field, and I wanted and thought that I would end up taking an approach where I went spread out with offenses and kind of underweight on the Giants. It ended up going underweight on Snell, playing a lot of contrarian pitching, and then getting more Giants than I'd expected. But this is a slate where I feel even more confident that I'm going to end up just not getting to as much Kansas City as the field. Because like yesterday, for example, we had the Giants being overowned, but we also had them as 3 times more likely than any other team to be the top scoring team on the stack here or on the slate. Here you have Kansas City. Yeah, they're number 1, but they're at 10.6%. Then you've got a bunch of teams between 8 and 9%. There's just not a big gap there at all. And the ownership is like double for Kansas City. So on the one hand, again, I think they are still really good values. If you can find ways to fit them in with lower owned players, that's fine. Benintendi, if he's batting in the middle of the order, is a great value. Mondesi is a phenomenal value. Lopez is a good value. Perez is always one of the best catcher options, but there's still plenty of other games to go to. There's still a lot of variance in baseball, and it just looks like a little bit too much ownership going to KC.
Yeah, and some of the individual ownership here, we have Salvador Perez and Adalberto Mondesi both coming right around 30% projected ownership. And then everybody else is in the teens to 20s. You got Andrew Benintendi at 20%. And then all these other guys from Nicky Lopez over to Michael Taylor, they're all 14 to 19% owned. So that's a lot of ownership going in offense. It's frankly not all that good. So to me, Kansas City Royals, I understand the spot. I love picking on Matt Harvey this year. But outside of rostering Royals as one-off type plays, I think that right now this just looks like an absurd amount of ownership for any individual team. I also want to backtrack to the Yankees Blue Jays game for a second, just to point some stuff out. Alek Manoah is currently projected for 3.5% ownership today. We have Luis Hill also very low projected ownership, 3.7%. As for the Yankees offense, they are rating out as a positive leverage. Surprisingly, though, the Toronto Blue Jays are actually coming in as the third most popular offense right now in our projections. We have an 11.5% ownership share going to Toronto. So the only two teams projected for more ownership, the Kansas City Royals, we just talked about, and the Atlanta Braves. So just to backtrack on that for a second, what do you make of the Toronto Blue Jays and the matchup against Luis Hill now that we know that the Blue Jays are going to be this popular?
Yeah, really surprised at the ownership projection there. Maybe it comes down, maybe it doesn't, but they do have a 4.9 implied run total, so I understand like why they would be somewhat appealing. I just kind of thought that Hill would get a little bit more respect here. If those numbers hold, it's going to be tough for me to get to the Blue Jays. Yeah, they're an offense I respect, but I also think Hill is a pretty solid arm. He is thrown 46 in the third innings at AAA this year with a 30% strikeout percentage. Mentioned before, a 28% strikeout percentage in the majors. It actually makes me, if Toronto is going to be that popular, it makes me somewhat interested in Hill at 7K. I still think it would be tough to get there often, but you are going to get a ton of ownership going to Mike Minor at that same price point. So you could use Hill as a lower owned pivot in tournaments.
Yeah, and that was certainly not ownership I was expecting from Toronto. The Yankees won kind of what we said, 4% projected ownership there. They are rating out as a very positively leveraged offense, but a little surprised to see how popular the Toronto Blue Jays are. Now, on the other side of this game, Mike Minor is going to be pitching against the Baltimore Orioles. Now, Minor has had overall
Is that so? Greg's out. I'm still here. Okay, so yeah, Minor has been solid this year. He's pretty much an average major league pitcher, in my opinion. Has a strikeout percentage at 22.5%, 4.32 xFIP, 1.5 home runs per nine. Decent spot here against Baltimore. We do know they have a lot of right-handed power, though, and I think it's a situation where Minor is just he's underpriced, so you're going to see a lot of ownership go there. We currently have him projected for 36% ownership, but probably going to get a little bit too much ownership given the negative park shift going into Baltimore, the fact that the Orioles offense does have plenty of right-handed power, especially if we get a healthy Baltimore lineup. Trey Mancini's missed the last couple of games. Ramon Urias was out yesterday. If these guys come back, the lineup does get a little bit deeper, a little bit more difficult to navigate. It's not that Minor isn't underpriced, but it's just that I think he's pulling a little bit too much ownership compared to some other options. In the top 2 pitchers tool, we have Mike Minor with a 12.5% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, but getting 36% ownership. By comparison, you have Tuki Toussaint at 9%, getting 12% ownership. Gutierrez at 12%, getting 6% ownership. So it's just a situation where, I think Minor is going to project the best out of that group. And he's probably the guy that you would look to as an SP2 in cash games if you need to pay down there. But in tournaments, I think that getting away from Minor a bit, moving some of that exposure to some of the other inexpensive pitchers that are getting less, and then also looking to this Orioles stack, especially if Mancini is back in the lineup, they're getting 6% ownership with a 4.5% chance of being in the top stack. So on their own, they're not projected to be underowned, but when you factor in the leverage you're getting against a 36% owned Minor who has had home run issues this year, I think Baltimore becomes pretty interesting. Is Greg back? No? All right. Not sure what the next game is that I'm supposed to go to, but I'm going to go to the Red Sox and Rays. Nathan Eovaldi facing Shane McClanahan. Game is a pick 'em, both teams with a 4.8 implied run total. Really difficult matchup for both pitchers, also two really good pitchers. So kind of a situation like we had in Toronto and New York, where I don't anticipate you see a lot of ownership going to either pitcher. I don't anticipate that you see a lot of ownership going to either stack. Right now, Tampa Bay with a 3% ownership share, Boston at 4%, Eovaldi at 4%, and McClanahan at 1%. So another situation where looking at medium projections, none of these guys are really going to jump out. But as I mentioned at the top, with the exception of Yu Darvish, most of the good pitchers on the slate do have difficult matchups. So I don't mind mixing in some Eovaldi and some McClanahan in tournaments where right now we have Yu Darvish projected for 62% ownership with a 32% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. He makes a ton of sense here. Darvish, I think, is a great play that we'll talk about later. But you have McClanahan and Eovaldi who basically are projected for about a 14% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. So right around half of Darvish's chances of being a top 2 pitcher, but they're getting, like 1/15th to 1/30th the ownership. So I think either of those guys can be used. If you are going to a popular Kansas City stack or you are going to a popular Toronto stack, something like that, I think either of those pitchers come into play. And then on the other side, you can kind of make the same case with the offenses, where both of these offenses have enough upside that they still give you a chance to win a tournament. All you have to do really is look back to yesterday, where you had Tampa Bay in a difficult matchup against Eduardo Rodriguez. Rodriguez is going to limit them a very, very high percentage of the time, but there's so much power in this lineup that when they're low owned, there's just tournament winning upside to get there. The payoffs are really, or the potential payoffs rather, are really good. So even though Eovaldi has been very good this season, he's typically not a pitcher I want to target against. I don't mind getting to some Tampa Bay. Wouldn't be a 3-man stack for me. Or a 3-max stack for me, I don't think. But if you're playing more lineups, I still don't mind getting there. Eovaldi has been good at limiting power, 130 expected ISO to lefties, 136 to righties. So there's not much I see in the Tampa Bay lineup that I'm looking at individually. It's more so just if Eovaldi happens to not have his best stuff, then clearly you would just want as many Tampa Bay guys as possible. So don't mind full stacks, nothing really individual as far as individual hitters go. For me, from the Tampa Bay side, on the Boston side, pretty much the same thing. McClanahan has been solid this year.
By the way?
What?
Can you hear? Okay. That was a good enough response. I don't know what happened there. That was so weird. So you were talking. I was able to hear and see you talking, but I started talking. I realized you weren't responding to me, and then you're like, "All right, Greg's not here." So I guess I'm not here then. So I just left Zoom and came back, and I guess it started working now. But all right. So just backtrack a little bit here. What also, this sounds weird. I don't know what. I hate technology. This is my absolute vendetta against technology right now. But so Boston and the Tampa Bay game. I heard what you said about Nathan Eovaldi going up against Tampa Bay, and then what are you touching on now? Shane McClanahan against Boston. Yeah,
I was about to just say the same thing, where McClanahan's good enough that there's not a whole lot that stands out to me individually from the Red Sox, but they do have a 4.9 implied run total, and they are still a high upside offense. They have Kike Hernandez back. So I feel pretty similarly about both of these teams, where individually there's not really one hitter that I'm looking at and saying, I think this guy's in a really good spot. It's more so that both teams have such good hitters where if either of these pitchers don't have their A game, you could just see things get ugly in a hurry because of how good the offenses are. And the fact that, Fenway does play up right-handed power. So I think tournament stacks make sense more so to me than one-offs here, I think.
Yeah, and we have on the Tampa Bay Rays right here, they have a 2.9% projected ownership compared to 8.3% chance being the top scoring team of the day. So the Tampa Bay Rays are actually the number 1 stack in our top stacks tool, which a little surprising to see for me against Nathan Eovaldi. Just based on the eye test, I don't know that I agree that Tampa Bay is tied for the second best odds to be the top scoring team on the slate. But by the same merit, I don't know that they should only be 2.9% owned. But does that surprise you at all to see them with an 8.3% projected chance to be the top stack of the day when we have, Cincinnati number 2 at 8.4? So pretty much in lockstep with everybody else at the top.
Yeah, kind of surprised how high they are. Because, again, I think Eovaldi is a good pitcher. He's been solid all season long. So maybe that comes down a little bit. But also one thing I have noticed, I don't remember if you and I think me and Josh talked about it, but it seems like Tampa Bay kind of always or often has a top stack percentage that is just a little bit higher than we expect. And I think it's just that they have so much power in their lineup that it's one of these teams where even if they're in a tough spot, they are just relatively likely to put up a slate winning score just because of how good their offense is. Whereas, you talk about a lot of other teams and it's just like, okay, even when they do well, what's it look like? And it looks like, they get a bunch of singles and doubles and maybe a home run or two and put up 8 runs that way. Whereas Tampa Bay, when they do well, it's just home run after home run after double after double. And so the ceiling is just naturally going to be a bit higher for a team like that.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, we've seen them in tough matches. They scored a million runs the other day when Chris Sale was pitching. They scored a whole bunch of runs off Erod. So there have been some tough matchups, particularly in this series against Boston, where we've seen them go off. And Nathan Eovaldi has been very good this year. He's had a good year, but I still think Chris Sale and Erod are better pitchers than him. We've seen Tampa Bay go off against them in recent slates, also at low ownership. So it's certainly something that's not crazy to think. And let's get a little reset of the show, cleanse the palate now that we've got both of us in Zoom, which, you were here the whole time, but I apparently wasn't. But today's show is sponsored by Jock Market. If you guys are new to Jock Market, Go on, download the app, and if you're making a first deposit, use the promo code Awesemo and get up to a $50 bonus on your first deposit. Jock Market, a totally different way to play daily fantasy sports. Look at as stocks as opposed to just being some sort of situation where we're building lineups. We don't have to worry about ownership. We don't have to worry about correlation. Stocks, there's an IPO period. We bid on the players after the games start. It doesn't mean that we're done tinkering with the lineups. You can still buy and sell players, whether you think they're going to end up coming back down to earth if they get off to a hot start, or maybe you think somebody's off to a bad start and you could buy low on them. Also, something else I'm going to add about Jock Market, Eitan and I today are going to be doing an NFL Jock Market show for the Thursday night game. So that's going to be on the YouTube channel later. So like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and get access to all the different content that goes up here. And if you want to play on Jock Market, don't forget, download the app, use the promo code Awesemo when you're making first deposit. All right, there we go. Now it's like a whole new show now. We've got the first few games down. We've got a reset here. And next game here, the Atlanta Braves at home against the Washington Nationals. Toki Toussaint on the mound for Atlanta, Sean Nolan for Washington, and already seeing right here in the YouTube chat somebody bringing up that they couldn't believe that Atlanta doesn't have higher top stack odds. But at the top, I mean, these teams are all very similar. So when I said the teams above Tampa Bay were Toronto and Cincinnati, they have 8.4% chance to be a top stack. Tampa Bay is 8.3. Atlanta also is 8.3. So we're really splitting hairs here. But the Atlanta Braves, the spot against Sean Nolan, they are expected to be one of the higher scoring teams on the slate, and the ownership dictates as much. This is the second most popular stack of the day, only behind the Kansas City Royals. So what do you make of the Atlanta Braves?
I like the spot. I don't think there's really any way around that. They are pulling quite a bit of ownership. They're nowhere near as overowned as Kansas City is, though. So I think I would be more inclined to be mixing the Braves bats into some lower owned lineups. Like I think I would get to them still before I get to Kansas City, because there's not that big of a gap in terms of top stack percentage between KC and Atlanta, and the ownership gap is basically double. Sean Nolan is not any sort of prospect. Going from memory, I want to say he's like 28 or something, and has thrown a total of like 50 something innings in the majors. 31. He's 31 and has thrown 48 and 2/3 innings in the majors. So same ballpark, not any sort of prospect. He's thrown 17 innings in the majors so far this year, 2.08 home runs per 9, 1.33 home runs per 9 at AAA. Just no real reason to think that he is going to be any good going forward in his limited sample, very limited sample, 187 expected ISO to righties. And this is just an Atlanta lineup that has tons and tons of right-handed power. You're not getting a good bullpen behind Nolan either. It just, I think, sets up as a really good spot. Jorge Soler completely mispriced at 3,900. Travis d'Arnaud completely mispriced at 3,800. The rest of the team, well, Swanson, Freeman, Albies, Riley are all priced, I think, pretty appropriately. The rest of the team outside of that, Adam Duvall at 4,200 is also cheap. So it's a lineup where you can get some value that's going to make it so that the overall stack isn't that expensive. And it's a very, very high upside spot for the Braves.
Yeah, and then on the other side, well, we'll say the pitching anyway, Toki Toussaint on the mound, and he's been up and down really throughout his career. He was a really well-regarded prospect coming into the big leagues. He also got off to a really hot start this year. He's come down to earth quite a bit since then. 4.19 ERA, 4.87 expected ERA. He still has good stuff, and the strikeout potential, maybe a little wanting with 22.1% K rate. The matchup against the Nationals, though, is pretty appealing, and I'm a little surprised he isn't picking up more ownership, just because we've seen basically any pitcher goes up against the Washington Nationals. The heartbeat generally has ended up being like 20 to 30% owned. Toki Toussaint is a somewhat appealing SP2 option to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, by the time we do the deeper dive show, if some of Mike Minor's projected ownership has been moved to Toussaint. But the way it looks right now, I don't really understand why there would be this big of a gap. We have Mike Minor with a 12.5% chance of being a top 2 pitcher at 6,700. Toussaint 600 more at 7,300. But typically, if you can get to one, you can get to the other one. 9.2% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. So a little bit lower, Minor basically 1.3 times is likely to be a top 2 pitcher. But Minor's pulling 3 times the ownership. If you look at their numbers for the season, they have identical 22.6% strikeout percentages. Toussaint's strikeout or walk percentage is 1.5 points higher. Nothing crazy there. His xFIP is 4.27 compared to 4.32 for Minor. Minor's given up 1.5 home runs per 9. Toussaint's given up 1.7. They've had extremely similar results. They have very similar matchups, I think. We know Baltimore has a lot of right-handed power, basically an average offense overall. Washington has been close to an average offense. Probably, I think if I had to choose which one I would rather have, I would take Baltimore over Washington at this point. But point being, they're both average-ish offenses. I just think it's a really, really similar spot for both of these guys. I don't think there should be that big of an ownership discount here.
Yeah, and then on the other side, I'm not really looking to stack the Washington Nationals against Toki Tucson. We've got Washington 3.1% projected ownership, 3.8% chance to be a top stack. That's all about fair, but I'm not sure this Washington Nationals team ever has all that much upside for playing 150 lineups. You want to be even with the field. I think that is fine. Sean Nolan as a pitcher, safe to assume that we have no interest in him.
Yeah, I can't see getting to Nolan here. To be fair, like there's certainly been pitchers in the past that I can't see getting to, and they somehow sneak in. But it's pretty tough to make a case for Nolan, especially because we have that mid-range of arms that look relatively appealing. I doubt that I need to go that cheap, and it's a really, really tough matchup against the Braves. So pretty tough to make a case there.
Yeah, the only way that I think I could see myself getting to Sean Nolan here is if we found out the Braves like 70% owned by the time we get to lock, and that's not happening. So I'm not going to be getting to Sean Nolan. Now the next game we have here to talk about, I really don't know what to make of Freddie Peralta at this point in the year. We've got the Milwaukee Brewers at home against the Philadelphia Phillies. Freddie Peralta on the year has been terrific, and he's been a very good fantasy option. But down the stretch of the season, I just never know what to make of his pitch count. I never know how deep he's going to be going into games. This has definitely been a little bit of an issue lately, for sure. Last two starts, he only went 2 innings in each. So just what do you make of Freddie Peralta down the stretch of the season, and what kind of length can we expect out of him?
Hell if I know. So his last start back he was returning from the injured list with shoulder. It was either shoulder inflammation. We didn't really know what to expect from him. It was kind of a situation where it was like he wasn't off for that long. So in theory, he could just go out there and throw a normal game. But we've also seen the Brewers trying to limit his innings anyway. We had those couple of starts, I don't know, a month and a half ago now, where he just like abruptly was pulled at 68 pitches because they were just like, yeah, okay, that's all we wanted from him today. And then after those couple of starts, he went back to throwing 90 plus pitches. So I would say there's a non-zero chance that we just get full Freddie Peralta here. I think that there's a much better chance that we get some sort of limited Freddie Peralta after he only threw 53 pitches in 2 innings last time out. He did give up 4 runs in those innings. So like he was struggling in his return. Who knows how much of that, if any of that had to do with his shoulder or if it was just rust or whatever. It's hard to say exactly how much of a factor, how much of a role that played in him coming out. Like if he had thrown 53 pitches and was looking really good, was that an actual pitch count? Or, was it just like, okay, we've seen enough of you today, like get out. You're not pitching well anyway. I think there's a very wide range of outcomes on Peralta here. At 10-2, I'm not super interested in finding out what happens because, it's just kind of the floor is really low for that salary. Definitely a spot where I haven't seen anything on it yet, but I'll be looking throughout the day, trying to find quotes from counsel about what they plan on doing with him. For now, my assumption would be you're getting 75 pitches or something like that, which wouldn't put him in play at 10-2. But definitely we'll keep an eye out for quotes. I know the last time we had these issues with Peralta after he had the 2 shortened outings, counsel actually had a quote where he was just like, yeah, we did it intentionally the first time. We didn't plan on doing it the second time, but we were winning by like 10 runs. So we just took him out. He's a full go today. So if you find a quote like that, Peralta is a really, really good option at 10-2. He's been fantastic this year. He has a 33.5% strikeout percentage, but without getting a quote like that, my assumption is going to be he's somewhat restricted on top of the fact that there is at least some risk that he's not fully healthy based on what we saw last start coming back from the injured list. There's without some quote saying that he can go 90 plus pitches if he's pitching well. I can't really bring myself to get to him.
Unfortunately, I think I will. And the reason is just because of the other pitchers kind of around him in this price range, the ownership going to them. So Yu Darvish has been crap in the second half of the year. Like he's been legitimately terrible. Not even bad by Yu Darvish standards, not even just but like legitimately bad. He's been one of the worst pitchers in baseball in the second half of the season. He's projected for 62% ownership today. And then we've got Frankie Montas in a tough matchup against Oakland, project for 43% ownership. There aren't that many places to go to as a pivot today. And then I just look at Freddie Peralta, 7% ownership. What are we getting out of him today? I have no clue. And it's something that, like you said, if we get more information on that's more definitive, that's probably going to change his ownership. But then it'll also give me a better idea of really how to approach him. But if he's really going to be 7% owned and we just have no clue what to expect out of him, I'm still willing to take the chance on Freddie Peralta when we see Yu Darvish project for 62% ownership. So at least to me, like I just don't know where else I'm going if I'm not playing him in this high end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a completely fair argument. I think for me, I probably would just end up getting out of the range. you could like I would use McClanahan and Eovaldi and be okay with that. But like, I think at least the way things look right now, I'd be okay just getting more like cheap pitching, getting more Gutierrez, getting more Toussaint at relatively low ownership, if I'm trying to, to pull back on some of the Montas and Darvish. But certainly agree with you. Like, just if we don't get anything, so like we don't get he's limited to 70 or 65, and we don't get he can throw 100. You're just saying, okay, the range of outcomes on Freddie Peralta is insanely wide here. I do agree that 7% ownership for him versus like 62 for Darvish, that is certainly a spot you can go to, because there is a non-0% of the time where Peralta is limited to 75 pitches and he still outscores Darvish by a lot, because Darvish does what he's been doing for the last month and a half. So I do agree with that. I think for me, I would probably just end up turning that into more bats and cheaper pitching.
Yeah, I think that's also a reasonable way to go. But I mean, I'm just, the ownership was also, we didn't have a whole lot of time to look at it, but we had zero time to look at it before we started the show because it didn't get updated until before. But it's just kind of a thing where on the fly, I'm looking at some of the ownership and I'm kind of trying to evaluate and make some decisions. And, just based on this mass amount of ownership going to guys like Darvish and Montas, and in the interest of pivoting, I think Freddie Peralta would make some sense. Now, on the other side, I think the Philadelphia Phillies make sense too, where this is a weird spot to me where the Phillies have a really good offense. Freddie Peralta is good, although we don't really know what we're getting out of him. But it seems like what the field is doing right now is saying, we don't want to roster Freddie Peralta. We don't want to roster the Phillies. Ultimately, one of these sides is going to win out, I think, in a somewhat substantial way. And at least when you have the Philadelphia Phillies project for 1% ownership and Freddie Peralta's project for 7% ownership on DK, 3% on FanDuel, this looks like a pretty good GPP spot to target just based on the ownership.
Yeah, I'm not sure that one side has to win out, though. Like, I still think the most likely scenario here is that Peralta throws like 70 pitches and pitches relatively well. So you're getting like 5 innings where the Phillies, score 1 run or whatever. Peralta doesn't really pay off his price tag. The Phillies still suck. I don't know. This is a spot where I could just see the middle coming in a lot. And someone did make the point in chat, and I think it's a very good point. The Brewers have an 11-game lead in the Central as well. So that's another reason I think the air towards the side of Peralta probably doesn't come out and just be turned loose. There's no real reason to, especially because they have already said that their intention is to do what they can to limit his innings. So, I'm never really opposed to getting to a 1% owned Phillies team. They do have a solid offense, but I think this is a spot where a lot of times you actually can get that situation where the pitcher does well, but not really well enough for DFS, and then the offense still doesn't do well.
Yeah, shout out to Mike Campbell in the YouTube chat. That is a fair point, that the Brewers, nothing to play for until the playoffs. I guess it depends how much they value home field advantage also, because they currently have a 607 win percentage where they are 3 games behind the Dodgers in the standings, 4 behind the Giants. So that's really, do they value trying to get home field advantage in the playoffs over those teams? Maybe, maybe not. Although, like you said, there have been some indications that maybe they don't value that all that much, considering that they've been really cautious with Freddie Peralta. Corbin Burns, they've limited his pitches a little bit in recent starts. So that is a fair point. I still am going to get overweight to Peralta. I'm just not exactly sure to what extent, but later on the day, I'll be on Live Before Lock. You'll be on Deeper Dive, and we'll have a little bit of a clearer idea. Maybe some more news comes out about actual pitch restrictions. We have an actual number we could put towards it. On the other side of the game, Kyle Gibson is going to be starting for the Phillies. Kyle Gibson has been, fairly good from a real life perspective this year, but as a DFS option, I still don't really love him that much. He's not a high strikeout guy. I don't love the matchup against the Milwaukee Brewers. He's also fairly expensive, $8,700 over on DK. On FanDuel, he's $9,000. I just don't think there's that much upside in paying up for Kyle Gibson.
Yeah, it's a pretty tough sell to me. If I had to sort of explain like the logic to getting the Kyle Gibson, I think it would be a case sort of like you were saying with Peralta, where if I decide I don't want to allocate a combined 100% of my exposure to Yu Darvish and Frankie Montas, 100% out of 200% for, talking DraftKings. So if I don't want to allocate, half of my total pitcher exposure to those two, it would kind of just end up getting filtered down to a bunch of other pitchers. I said Eovaldi, McClanahan would get some. Manoah at 8,400 would probably pull some. But, you could see where at 8,700, getting 2% ownership with an 8% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, it's just like, okay, well, I'll play, 8 or 10% Gibson or something like that. But outside of that, which is very clearly a 150 max argument and not even a really strong one, it's more of just you could do this if you wanted to, and it would be fine. It's just a price tag I don't really want to get to. He comes into this game with a 19% strikeout percentage for the year, 4.22 xFIP. He's, like you said, he's an okay, pretty good real life pitcher. He's not bad. at limiting runs, but he doesn't really get strikeouts. He's never really gotten strikeouts. I've always thought he should be a much better DFS pitcher than he is. He just is cool with getting ground balls and throwing his sinker a lot, as opposed to throwing things that batters actually swing and miss. And that doesn't translate to DFS points. And then on top of that, Milwaukee is a relatively difficult matchup, not a great park to pitch in either. So pretty tough sell for me on Gibson.
Yeah, and then the Milwaukee Brewers on the other side, not an offense I'm dying to get to. They have about fair odds of being a top stack relative to their ownership share. The matchup against Kyle Gibson is less than ideal for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's overall pitched well this year. And then number two, also, like you said, heavy ground ball pitcher, 52.4% ground ball rate. The other thing also, he has had some home run issues in the past. The biggest improvement he's made to his game this year has just been limiting those home runs. Last year, 26.7% home run fly ball rate. This year, a career low 9.2%. So all that considered, I don't think stacking against Kyle Gibson is the best course of action either.
Yeah, 128 expected ISO to left-handed hitters, 0.094 to righties, 278 expected WOBA to righties, 317 to lefties. He's been good in terms of production. The Brewers are pretty cheap, but kind of like we've said, I mean, there's pitching to pay up for in the sense that like Yu Darvish is obviously in a really good spot, but it's not like it's one of those slates where you have either a really expensive like 11K plus pitcher in a good spot or multiple pitchers that you really want to pay up to and get. I don't think the value is going to end up being that useful on this slate. So just kind of a middle of the road team that I doubt I get a whole lot of exposure to.
All right, a little more than halfway through the slate. We've got 4 games left here to talk about. If you guys haven't done it already, do us a favor, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we've got football season starting and there is content for everything on the YouTube channel. We've got just today, we've got the NFL Strategy Show coming up after this. So Lofty doing his regular football videos. We've got the NFL Jock Market Show that I'm going to be doing with Aton. And then, of course, we have our normal MLB content, the MLB Deeper Dive, MLB Live Before Lock. So make sure you're subscribed. If you're playing DFS for basically every single sport there's out there, we have everything covered. So everything, you could spend your entire day with us. You could wake up, turn on your computer, listen to the Awesemo YouTube channel, and we've got you covered for entertainment and DFS content all throughout the day. And he gets the out of it more often, which who doesn't want to do that? But next game we've here to talk about now. Vladimir Gutierrez on the mound for the Cincinnati Reds. Gutierrez has pitched better in the second half of the season, and it was somebody who really struggled in the first half. But I think what is really important here is a matchup against the Chicago Cubs, who have played much better as of late, except overall for the season, and particularly ever since the trade down, they traded away everybody. It's been a very weak offense. And the other thing to consider here too, Cubs surprisingly picking up a little bit of ownership. So you alluded to liking Vladimir Gutierrez earlier. What are some of the reasons why?
That's a strong commitment. I don't want to go that far, but he's pitching against the Cubs, and that is typically enough reason to consider someone. I mean, you just go back to yesterday, they made Wade Miley look like an ace. Miley, a guy with, about an 18% strikeout percentage. Gutierrez this year, 17.9%, 509 xFIP, 1.54 home runs per 9. I don't think he's a good pitcher. He has pitched a bit better recently. So, if you want something to look at to make you feel a little bit better, you could look at some recent games. But overall, I don't think he's very good. I think the Cubs are also not very good, though. And it's just a spot where I don't think the range of outcomes is drastically worse for Gutierrez compared to someone like Mike Minor. Actually, in the top 2 pitchers tool, they are neck and neck. 12.5% chance of being a top 2 pitcher for Minor at $6,700, $1,000 more for Gutierrez, 12.3% chance for being a top 2 pitcher. So yeah, again, Minor is going to project as the better value, but basically the same range of outcomes, and the $1,000 isn't that difficult to find typically. And you're getting 160 ownership going to Gutierrez. So it's just a situation where I think, Minor projects better. He's where if you have to go to one of these guys as an SP2 in cash, that's where you would go. But I don't really think there's much of a difference here. I think Gutierrez does still have a pretty nice ceiling against a Cubs team that by far leads the league in strikeout percentage since the trade deadline.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider, and also Minor is a little bit cheaper, but the last time Minor scored more than 17 fantasy points in a start was July 26th against the Chicago White Sox. And he's only had a handful of upside starts the entire season. Vladimir Gutierrez, I know we've got Mike Verderosa in the YouTube chat. He's not happy with how Vlad Gutierrez pitched against Miami Marlins a couple of starts ago. And his last 2 starts in easy matchups have not been good. Gutierrez last time out against the Detroit Tigers pitched 3 1/3 inning, gave up 3 runs, only struck out 1. The time before that against the Marlins pitches 3 innings, only registers 2 strikeouts, gives up 5 earned runs. But the start before that against Miami, he scored 31 fantasy points, and against Cubs, 18. Against the Braves in Atlanta, 23. Against Pittsburgh, 23. Against the Mets, 22.7.
And Greg is on. But yeah, the point here that
so we've seen some upside from Gutierrez, the fantasy points.
You're back.
I'm gone again?
No, you're back. You were gone. You're gone again. Okay, so I think the point Greg was going to make, and if it's not, it's what I was going to follow up with, is that, like Minor, Gutierrez is not a good pitcher, and you shouldn't feel...
Dude, this is so weird. I don't understand.
You're gone. You shouldn't feel comfortable going to Gutierrez in the sense that, like, oh, I think he's going to do well. But DFS isn't about... You don't win money by... Nobody is correct often enough to actually win money by just being like, oh, this pitcher is going to have a good game today, and I'm the only one that knows that. It's more about putting yourself in a position to get paid off when things go your way, and that's why I think Gutierrez versus Minor makes a lot of sense in tournaments, because yes, Minor is going to beat him. Like if someone offered you even odds and you get to pick Minor or Gutierrez, you're taking Minor every time and you're printing money. But in DFS, because of the payout structure in tournaments, the ownership factors in. And even though Gutierrez projects a point or two lower in terms of median projection, and he's likely to finish behind Minor, he's going to beat Minor often enough to be worth this, basically 6-1 discount. And you're still going to be able to get functionally the same team in terms of the offenses you're able to afford, because it's only a 1K difference in salary. So it's not that you're expecting Gutierrez to frequently have really good starts here. He's not a good pitcher. It's that you're expecting him to do well often enough to justify the difference in ownership between him and Minor. So like he's going to have bad starts. It wouldn't be surprising at all if he does today, but it's kind of why you just have to look at all DFS sports, but especially one that has as much volatility as baseball, as a season-long thing where like you're going to get wrecked on a lot of slates, but it's going to happen sort of regardless of what you do. You can play the safe pitcher in Minor. He's still going to suck a lot of the time. You can play the riskier guy in Gutierrez. He's going to suck a lot. But at least when Gutierrez does well, you're putting yourself in a more advantageous position than when you're going to the 36. What just happened? Am I good? Am I live? Okay. Not sure what the last thing that I said was, but good. I'm completely lost now. So the Cubs, my interest in the Cubs is really going to have to do with the ownership projected for Gutierrez, because right now I think the Cubs are projected for a little bit more ownership than they deserve. It's not a bad spot. They are cheap, but what will really make me interested in the Cubs is if Gutierrez were to start pulling more ownership. If he were to start, approaching Mike Minor's ownership numbers, then I think I start getting to the Cubs. As it is right now, like the Orioles are appealing to me because of how much ownership Minor is pulling, whereas Gutierrez just isn't pulling enough for me to really want to get to the Cubs. On the other side, pretty decent matchup for the Reds against Alec Mills. He hasn't been bad in terms of run prevention this year. As a starter, he has a 3.96 xFIP, 17.3% strikeout percentage, only a 4.5% walk percentage, less than 1 home run per 9 innings. But he's another pitcher that doesn't strike out a lot of guys, only a 17.3% strikeout percentage this season. Hasn't given up a whole lot of power, but this Reds lineup does have plenty of power. They are pretty affordable. You once again have Tyler Naquin at $2,900, most likely batting second. Jonathan India is always a strong second base option. Votto is cheap. Moustakas is right around 5K, as is Castellanos. And then the bottom of the order is really cheap. So Cincinnati, I think, looks pretty decent here. They are getting ownership, though. They're up at about 9.5% aggregate ownership. We have them tied with Toronto, basically in that same spot with Atlanta and Tampa Bay, basically all vying for second in top stack percentage. So the ownership about where it should be. I think the Reds look fine, but would want the ownership to come down a little bit for me to really start getting there. So next we have, or at least I have no idea what Tyler has, Dodgers and Cardinals. the yeah. So Dodgers and Cardinals. Dodgers are favored here, 4.5 implied run total. Cardinals at 4.1. Adam Wainwright going for the Cardinals. Mitch White expected to go for the Dodgers, it looks like. I thought he was supposed to go yesterday, but apparently he didn't. So he's been announced as the starter for today's game. The last time he started, or his last two games, he threw 72 pitches against the Rockies on the 29th. Against the Pirates, he had a really, really good start where he went 7 1/3 through 91 pitches on August 18th. So because he is starting, I expect him to go a little bit deeper into this game, but his salary is also priced up to 8,200. It's a matchup against the Cardinals where they're one of the more difficult teams to strike out in baseball. They're not a bad offense either in terms of production, pretty much league average. So it's pretty tough, I think, for me to get to White, even though he is starting because the salary increased. If he was still at 6,800, I'd be interested. On the other side, Wainwright's salary has come down a bit, and I think it should because he's got a really difficult matchup here against the Dodgers. Clearly not a team that we really want to pick on. So on the one hand, Wainwright's having a good year, 22.5% strikeout percentage. It's actually the exact same as Mike Minor and Touki Toussaint, 3.74 xFIP, 0.87 home runs per 9, but still a pretty tough sell against the Dodgers, especially because right now he is projected to pull some ownership. He has a 12% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, about a 10% ownership projection. So if his ownership comes down a little bit, I'd be more interested because it would help to make up for the fact that the matchup is really difficult. But if he's projected for about 10% ownership, I think I end up just sort of moving to the cheaper pitchers or pitchers in that price range that are getting a little bit less ownership. As far as bats go, the Cardinals, I think, are not that appealing, more so looking at one-offs there because we do have some cheap bats. Dylan Carlson at 3,200 looks like a pretty good value. Tyler O'Neill at 3,700 is never someone I mind getting to at a cheap price tag because he's got a lot of power and he's not expensive. As far as stacks go, though, I think even though Wainwright is having a good year, I'm more inclined to look to the Dodgers here. 5.4% chance of being the top stack, only 2% aggregate ownership. They are relatively inexpensive compared to where they normally are. Trey Turner at 5,100 on DraftKings, Muncy at 5K, Betts at 5,200. Everyone else $4,900 or less. So relatively easy to get to this team compared to, again, how expensive they normally are. Wainwright is a good pitcher, but this is just a team that has tons of talent, not getting much ownership. They give you the same sort of upside that these more popular teams give you, the Braves, the Reds, the Blue Jays. The Dodgers have hitters that can compete with those teams. So I do like getting to the Dodgers in larger field tournaments, even though I have respect for Wainwright. It looks like Greg might be back.
Maybe, who knows? I could hear you, but I've been able to hear you this entire time. But I was DMing with Tyler in Slack, and I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, apparently we're having some issues with Zoom. He said that it was glitching a little bit on his end too. But yeah, I don't know, like how I'm talking, and then all of a sudden I'll hear you say, "Oh, Greg's gone." I'm like, "No, I'm right here." It's almost like when you're watching like a movie or whatever, and there's like that bit they'll do where everybody in the family pretends there's like a 4-year-old kid and they can't see him, and the kid like freaks out and they're like, "No, I'm here. I can see you." Like that's exactly what I feel like. It's like, no, I'm here, Adam. I'm here. I want to talk about baseball, but then it just doesn't work. But I heard what you said about the Los Angeles Dodgers there, and yeah, I agree. Also, just based on some of the ownership we have here, it's really low, and it's the Dodgers offense. So this is kind of where, if people remember at the top of the show, like 3 times ago before everything stopped working, we were talking about how we thought that the Yankees and Toronto Blue Jays could have lower ownership. The Blue Jays, we ended up getting ownership updates. That's not the case. But the Yankees are a low-owned offense at 4.6%. And I view the Dodgers in a similar scenario where this is a very good offense. I understand they're going up against a good starting pitcher. Whenever we can get reduced ownership on a spot like the Dodgers, it makes sense. The other thing, too, is as we talk about some of these more popular starting pitchers that are about to come up on these games, Frankie Montas, 23. Frankie Montas on DK is 43% owned over on FanDuel, 23. Yu Darvish today, 62% owned on DK. If we're going to try to differentiate and pay for some cheaper starting pitching, it's going to make sense to pay up for contrarian offenses. And in that spot, that's another way we could differentiate by getting to the Dodgers. Did you talk about the Cardinals at all and going up against Mitch White?
Yeah, briefly touched on them, just said that I thought they were not in a great spot in terms of a full stack, but that I do think guys like Dylan Carlson and Tyler O'Neill are a little bit underpriced.
All right. So we've got 2 games left. Fingers crossed that the internet Zoom, everybody cooperates with us here. But I think this is the most important spot of the slate to talk about. Yu Darvish at home against the Angels. And the Angels offense, I assume that we're not going to have Shohei Ohtani starting again today, although maybe they will. But Yu Darvish today, obviously a terrific matchup against the Angels. But Darvish has legitimately not pitched well over the last couple of months. He's projected for 62% ownership today on DK, by far the chalk of the slate. Over on FanDuel, even on a single pitcher site, projected for nearly 50% ownership. How are you handling all this ownership going to Darvish?
It's tough because on the one hand, it completely makes sense. Like if you look at his numbers for the season, he has a 29.2% strikeout percentage, 3.68 xFIP. The Angels, assuming that Ohtani's not in the lineup since they don't have a DH, the Angels are a really good matchup. They are essentially a minor league team without Ohtani. You probably will have Walsh back in the lineup today, but still plenty of strikeouts here. When you look at, Walsh strikes out, Adele strikes out at a high rate, Marsh strikes out a ton, Stassi strikes out. It's a really good matchup, but it is concerning how bad Darvish has been recently, at least in terms of his results. I mean, you're coming off of this game against Arizona where he went 2 2/3, gave up 5 earned runs, lost 3 DraftKings points. He was okay against the Dodgers to start before that, 4 earned in 6 innings, 5 earned runs and 2 2/3 against Arizona again. Had a good start against Arizona before that, gave up 5 runs in 6 innings at home against the Rockies previously. Like, these are bad teams. 4 earned runs in 5 innings against Miami. Like, it's not like he ran into a really tough stretch of schedule and just has, been getting lit up by like the Dodgers and the Astros or something. He's just been getting lit up by really bad teams. So, and Darvish kind of has a history throughout his career. He's just been like such an enigmatic pitcher where it'll be like, oh man, Darvish doesn't have it anymore. He's giving up a ton of home runs. He can't throw strikes. And then he'll just like come back and, it's like, oh, over his last 10 starts, he's walked 2 batters. And so it's really difficult to like pinpoint exactly what is going on with him. On a slate like this, I'm still inclined to get a good amount of him just because he does, I think, project as the clear number 1 option. You don't have anyone else at the top that doesn't have concerns. Like Freddie Peralta, we spent a lot of time talking about the issues with him. You have other pitchers up there that just have tough matchups, whether it's Evaldi or McClanahan or, whoever. So yeah, you can be worried about how Darvish has looked lately, but at the same time, you can't just ignore the concerns everyone else has. Also worth noting that if you go back to the start of July, he's made 9 starts. He still has a 26.8% strikeout percentage, 3.58 xFIP. If you go back to the start of August, it's 4 starts, 2.48 xFIP, 30.5% strikeout percentage. So it's also possible that he's just getting really unlucky, or at least that's contributing to it. So I'm still inclined to go to Darvish. 60% ownership is certainly scary, though. I mean, and I said earlier, like I was more confident in Snell last night than I am in Darvish tonight. And I still ended up very far under the field on Snell just because of how my lineup shook out. So it's certainly justifiable, I think, to just say I'm not playing the 60% owned guy in that many lineups. That's fine. But I do think, I guess it's a situation where I think reasonable minds could differ. Like if somebody gets around the field on Darvish and then takes a lot of lower owned stacks, I would have no issue with that because I think he is the number 1 pitcher tonight. But if you also wanted to give yourself exposure to some of the more popular teams, whether that's Cincinnati or Atlanta or Kansas City or whoever, at the expense of some of that Darvish exposure, I think that's a viable way to play the slate as well.
Yeah, and I mean, you just look at some of these numbers in the second half of the year for Darvish, and like you said, the strikeouts are still there. So here are his numbers post All-Star break. He does have a 27.6% K rate, but he's a 5.25 FIP. So he's giving up a whole bunch of runs, and he still has a 297 BABIP. So it's not like he's getting BABIP to death. He's just not pitching particularly well. Overall, he is giving up a lot of home runs. And you know who he's kind of most similar to, even though the struggles are a little bit different because he's not necessarily walking everybody, but second half Darvish is a little bit similar to me to first half Blake Snell, where it's like he's not pitching well, but there's still fantasy upside because you're generating a lot of strikeouts. So I think the other thing we have to talk about is the Angels on the other side. They don't have good top stack odds whatsoever. We don't have a 1.8% chance of being the top scoring team of the slate. I'm still inclined to get to them just because of Darvish's ownership.
Yeah, I don't mind it. I don't know if I will get there. I think it's a good strategy. It's a small enough slate too, where there's still opportunity costs for sure. But like with there not being a Coors Field game, with Kansas City being the team that has the highest top stack percentage on the slate, it's not quite as difficult to imagine a low probability team like the Angels, actually coming through. Like a lot of the time, the way that I kind of view it, like last night, for example, with Texas against, with the Angels. Well, yeah, either Texas against Gallen or the Angels against Snell, either one. It was kind of just like, I think even if they ruin Gallen's start or Snell's start, they score, like 5 runs and they end up not really being useful in terms of winning you a tournament. Here, there are enough good pitchers going tonight. There haven't really been many offenses that were just like, oh, I love this spot for them. It's more so like, oh, I like them at low ownership because they're good. So I could see the case for getting to the Angels a bit more so tonight than I could last night.
Yeah, and once again, it's such an absurd amount of ownership going to Darvish, and it definitely is something that gives me a little bit of pause when I see that we have the Angels with a 1.8% chance to be the top scoring team of the slate, and that's not even that positive with leverage when you consider they have a 1% projected ownership share. But it's more just all that ownership going to Darvish that I feel inclined to get to a little bit of the Angels. But once again, it's not a super confidence act. It's like over the course of 150 lineups, I probably have like 3-4% of them just as a little bit of leverage there off the field relative to the Darvish ownership. But starting for the Angels, it is going to most likely be a bullpen game. Jimmy Herget is going to be on the mound for them. We know the Angels have a bad bullpen, so what are you expecting out of their pitching situation?
Nothing good. Yeah, don't know a ton about Herget other than I've seen him come into games when I need the opposing team not to hit well, and it never makes me feel good because he doesn't look very good. But yeah, I mean, it's a bullpen game. Those typically aren't very appealing to target, but the Padres do still have a 4.9 implied run total. This, again, it's a slate where there's not a ton of offenses I love. They are projected for a pretty decent amount of ownership right now, though. Looking to see how much of that is just Fernando Tatis, because I'm typically willing to write that off. And yeah, Tatis 18%. Next highest ownership projections are Myers and Machado at about 9.5%. So overall, not crazy ownership going to the Padres. I think it's a pretty good spot for them. I don't really feel super strong about them compared to like the Dodgers or the Yankees. I think it's just another one of those pretty good offenses in an okay spot.
Yeah, we've got Will Myers, only 3,400 on DK. He's projected for 9.8% ownership. He does stand out as a value play there, but also, like you said, Fernando Tatis is very popular individually. That is what's driving a lot of that ownership to the Padres. Now, the final game on the slate and the other chalk pitcher to talk about, Frankie Montas at home against the Chicago White Sox. Montas is very, very popular today, still on a different tier ownership-wise than what we're seeing out of Yu Darvish. 23.5% projected ownership for Montas on FanDuel. On DK is projected for 43.5% ownership. So with all that in mind, 62% of the field is playing Darvish, 43% Montas. Almost not every line, a very large portion of lineups are going to be playing either Darvish or Montas today. For cash games, I guess you just go out and play both of them. It's not going to be that hard to save salary to get up to these pitchers. But the matchup for Montas against the White Sox, it's certainly not ideal.
Yeah, it's not a great matchup. I mean, it is a 3.7 implied run total. The game is in Oakland, which is nice. It helps cut down on that White Sox power. And Montas is, I think, a good pitcher. We've seen him getting more strikeouts against righties going forward, which is something that I think you and I had talked about, but not really surprising to see. He, for a long stretch this season, he was striking out lefties at a much higher clip than righties. And even still, 29.8% strikeout percentage against lefties, 23.7 against righties overall. But he's really increased his splitter usage to lefties, which explains why the strikeout numbers there have increased. But his pitch mix against righties hasn't really changed this year compared to previous years. And his strikeout numbers in previous years were always better, or were always really, really good against righties. So I thought it was likely that you would see strikeouts start to increase going forward. Against right-handed hitters over his last 5 starts, a 33.9% strikeout percentage. So you have seen those numbers start to climb up. And I think, that's to be expected. I think he's a very good pitcher. I think 9K is too cheap of a price tag. I also think 43% ownership against the White Sox is a little aggressive. We have him with a 20% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, 43% ownership projection on DraftKings. I like you said, in cash, I think it's fine. In tournaments, it's fine too. If you're using more contrarian stacks, I think Montas is one of the best pitcher options. But, you just look at some of the options around him. And even if you ignore Peralta because there's so much uncertainty there right now, and we've already talked about him, but even beyond that, like Alek Manoah, 14% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. So, Montas basically 1.5 times as likely to be a top 2 pitcher compared to Manoah, but he's getting 15 times the ownership. Same kind of thing with McClanahan, same kind of thing with Eovaldi. There's all of these other pitchers that if you are rostering a stack that's getting some ownership, you can go to these pitchers that are good and in tough matchups because, yeah, maybe they don't project quite as well as Montas, but let's not pretend Montas is facing the Rangers or some, minor league team here. The White Sox can put an end to his night really quickly, no matter how good he is. You can't, I guess my point is like, even though this spot does look better for Montas than it does for Eovaldi or McClanahan or Manoah, and that's reflected in the implied run total where the White Sox are like a full run lower than who those pitchers are facing, you can't just completely look and say, oh, I'm not rostering Manoah against the Yankees. That's a tough spot. Or I'm not rostering McClanahan against the Red Sox. That's a tough spot. Give me Montas against the White Sox. Like, yeah, it's a better spot, but you can't just ignore that the White Sox are also a good offense.
Yeah, and I mean, we're seeing in the YouTube chat too, somebody brought it up here. Nate Duco brought up here, White Sox is a leverage team. I feel a little bit better about the White Sox's leverage team than the Angels just because their offense doesn't suck, which is a big upgrade over the Angels who, especially if Ohtani is in the line, but it's just going to be nothing but replacement level players. But the Chicago White Sox as a stack, considering the Montas ownership, is that sensible?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's at least a spot where you have an offense with power. Like normally when you are in situations like this, and it kind of just goes back to how weird Montas's projected ownership sort of is. Normally when you talk about a pitcher getting this type of ownership, when you talk about the leverage stack, you're just saying like, yeah, I don't really know exactly how they score runs, but if they do, it would be good. Like the White Sox score runs because they have a really, really good offense. The park sucks. The matchup is tough. I'll give you all of that, but they're not really expensive. Luis Roberts back down to $4K. Moncada's at $3,900. They just don't need to come through all that often to reward you nicely here. 3% chance of being the top stack, only about 1% aggregate ownership. And, if they throw 5 runs on Montas for the first 3 innings, 40% of the field just lost, and it doesn't even matter what offense they stacked. So, if I'm going to a leverage stack, I would rather get to the White Sox than the Angels. I think that is without question.
Yeah, and the only player, I know you mentioned cheap price tags. We got Yasmani Grandal is expensive. There is not another hitter in this lineup that's priced anywhere in line with where they've been most of the season. So Grandal at 5,000, that's generally not going to be my favorite play in lineup. But everybody else, I love getting to from 5-man stack. And there's not a single player that's popular. So it's not like you have to go and say like, I'm going to try to fit Lurie Garcia in here to differentiate. Every single player in this lineup is projected for 1% ownership. So the White Sox, to me, are a team I want to get to for leverage, really without much question here, because everybody, it's a good offense. Nobody's owned. It's cheap. They're going up against a chalk pitcher. This is a spot I usually like to get to. Now, closing this show out by talking about the other side of the game, Dallas Keuchel is going to be on the mound for Chicago against Oakland. Even on a slate without that many good pitching options, I can't reasonably get to Dallas Keuchel. He's been bad this year, and he strikes out nobody.
Yeah, I can't get to Keuchel. I'm interested to see if we agree on the A's, though.
So the Oakland A's, it's interesting. I very rarely like to stack against Dallas Keuchel just because of his heavy ground ball, the heavy amount of ground balls he generates. But with that said, the Oakland A's are projected for no ownership today, and Dallas Keuchel is a very poor starting pitcher. And bringing up his numbers for the year, and even though there haven't been that many individual starts where he's just gotten destroyed, he has a 5.22 ERA. His underlying numbers look worse. And still, the last few starts for him also have been out of line with his team for most of the season, where he's had a lot of starts this year where it's like, 5 innings, 3 runs for Dallas Keuchel. His last 3 starts, 5 innings, 6 runs, 1 inning, 6 runs, and 3 innings, 6 runs. And he's only given up 1 home run in those starts. But either way, if you're scoring that amount of runs against him in a short amount of time, I'm fine with it. As long as there's no ownership here going to Oakland, I think this is a team that's picking up way less ownership than they should.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stacks right now. And this kind of just comes back to, you can say whatever you want about, an individual matchup, but DFS still really is just coming down to salary, projection, ownership, basically trying to get like the best combination of all of that. And yeah, Keuchel, when he's on, is getting ground balls, but he's been bad this year. He's given up 1.4 home runs per 9 innings. He's allowed a 189 actual ISO, 204 expected ISO to right-handed hitters. This park is great for Keuchel. He can let them hit the ball a mile and it's going to get caught on the warning track, but it's still such a good Oakland offense that has tons and tons and tons of power, mostly from the right side. Matt Olson from the left side, but he hits everyone. It doesn't really matter. And it also goes back to there not really being that one offense on the slate where it's just like, yeah, they're not getting ownership and I love them. There's offenses where it's like, yeah, they're not getting ownership and I think they're really good, so I'll play them. But it's, it's also a tough matchup. Here, it's just like, okay, nobody's going to roster the A's. They have a 5% chance of being the top stack. The number one stack on this slate, Kansas City, is only projected for 10%. So they are only twice as likely, whereas they're getting 10 times the ownership, give or take. I love Oakland here. They just give you so much power. They have a 4.9 implied run total, which, is right up there with any of the top teams tonight. We have, at the moment, Atlanta is first with a 6 implied run total. After that, it's the Yankees at 5.2, Kansas City at 5.1. There's functionally no difference between them and Oakland here. I love Oakland here against a pitcher that has not been able to keep the ball in the yard like he used to, does not miss bats whatsoever, has a 12.4% strikeout percentage against right-handed hitters, and is going to be facing a ton of guys with power.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the real thing here that stands out is even though Dallas Keuchel, like I've said, and I'm sure that over the course of the season, shows we've done together, I typically don't stack against him all that much, but 1.7% projected ownership share going to the Oakland A's, 5.1% chance to be a top value, its overall top scoring team. So I certainly prefer them to teams like Toronto or Kansas City. They're picking up massive amounts of ownership. So I'll go as far to say that right now, if I was to be submitting my lineups, I think Oakland would be my most rostered team.
I think so too. And Sean V commented that the White Sox have a good bullpen. I think that is always worth mentioning. And it's just, but you have to keep in mind that you can't just point to one thing and say, this is why I'm not going to play this team. Would I prefer to get a low owned team with a ton of power against a bad starting pitcher and a bad bullpen? That would be awesome. Can we put them in a park better than Oakland as well? But it still just comes down to it makes it a less appealing spot, but all things considered, they still are not getting nearly as much ownership as they probably deserve, given how good their offense is. Yeah,
so I think that pretty much does it for us, but that doesn't mean you guys should be going anywhere because we've got NFL shows coming up. We've got later on the day, MLB Deeper Dive, MLB Live Before Lock. Like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and good luck today, guys.